Hey everybody, welcome to The Bottom Line. I'm Michael Noland. You know what I thought I would do today is cover the 10 most perfect classic rock albums of all time. Now this is going to be my list, folks, but you know what? I had a list of about 30 or 40 albums on this. I didn't number it, but I did get to the top 20, and we're going to cover the top 20. Now, numbers 11 through 20, I'm not going to put in any particular order, and there'll be a reasoning for that. Just follow me with this, and you'll see what I'm trying to get at. What I'm going to do is put out 4 polls, because these are 20 songs, and there'll be a list of 5 albums that you can vote on. Now, although I'm not really ranking numbers 20 through 11 in any particular order tonight, I will be ranking the top 10, or at least based on my criteria, and we'll get to that in just a moment. But what I'm going to do based on the results of those polls is I'm going to do a video based on the tribal consensus on these albums. Now, I know this poll system isn't perfect. You're going to find several albums that you want to vote for in each category, but each and every one of you will get a chance to vote 4 times on this list. That's about as fair as I can make it. Now, I'm going to look at the percentages of that, and in my response video, I will give the tribe's top 20 list my full attention in that video, and I'll be releasing that early on my Patreon, and then the following day it'll be here on the main channel. So here we go. Fasten your seatbelts, because folks, we're going for a ride. All right, so as usual, when I put together one of these lists on this channel, I usually give you a set of criteria that I go by. The first set of criteria on these albums will be song strength. I will also be taking into consideration the production of the album and all that's involved. That could be basic mixing all the way to what we got as a final product. And of course, I always include this. I look for a gloss when I look for perfection, and these albums, one way or another, have exactly that. Now, another thing that I took into consideration was whether or not these particular albums set themselves apart from what these artists' contemporaries put out at that time. And do these albums make a statement, either through lyrics or music or both? And then, because it's my list, my final criteria is my own personal bias. Okay, so let's get on to this list. Now, these first 10 are not in any particular order. I just got them on a list, and I'm going to follow down that list, okay? Now, the first one on this list is John Lennon's Plastic Ono Band. Now, as far as making a statement, doing something that nobody else has done at that particular time, the isolative tracks, this is a top-notch album. In fact, it is my favorite John Lennon solo album. But because it is a stripped-down recording process here, most of the tracks done live right there in the studio, it doesn't have quite the gloss I was looking for, but that does not mean it's a lesser album. On another list, this might be number 1. So, John Lennon's Plastic Ono Band. Next up, since we're talking about the Beatles, how about George Harrison's All Things Must Pass? Oh, production, gloss, everywhere on this album. Song strength, it's got that. Did it stand alone from other albums put out by his peers? Yes and no. First of all, a triple album, well, really a double album, and the fact that I consider this album a double album with a bonus disc, that's why it's on the lower half of this list tonight. But George would never, and I mean ever, touch these heights again, and I love Cloud 9. Next up, not making the top 10, and you guys all know I love this album, Queen 2 by the rock band Queen. Now, if you ever want to talk about an album that has production, this one is it, right down to how they designed the album itself. Remember, I told you, instead of a side 1 or a side A or a side 2 and a side B, you have side white and side black, with most of side black having their heavy metal kind of influenced songs there, digressing ever once in a while into very light touches. And then on side A is their lighter stuff that would get really crunchy at times. Isn't that the perfect yin yang? Was it different than anything else their peers was doing? You damn right it was. Queen took us all by surprise. But I do have to say one thing, though. If I'm going to include this album and not include A Night at the Opera, the reason is this is my favorite album. Like I said, my own bias. And Night at the Opera, if I had put it on this list, might actually go higher. It's just that I don't think the individual songs on Night at the Opera are as strong as the individual songs on Queen 2. But as far as gloss goes, Queen 2 has that, but Night at the Opera outshines it in that particular point. Next up, my favorite album by the Eagles, Desperado. Now, this is cowboy gloss, if there ever was such a thing. Almost a concept album, and if you're like me, you can read your own concept every damn time. You can rewrite the story every time that you hear this album. And as far as song strength, folks, this is the Eagles' strongest album. You know, everybody goes for Hotel California. There's a couple of weak tracks on that as far as I'm concerned. Not a single weak track on this album. Next up, Steely Dan. All right? And no, it's not Asia. Although if Asia was on this as far as gloss and production, hey, you can't get any better than that. But you see, I was a Steely Dan fan the second Can't Buy a Thrill came out. I saw him on American Bandstand, right? And I went, what's that song, you know? And I went out and bought the album that day. I mean, as soon as Bandstand was over. And so in my heart, that first album is my favorite, I guess. But the best album that Steely Dan ever put out, and take a look at the cover, folks. Take a look at that and tell me that that couldn't represent a headline in today's news. Mental illness is discussed in this album, mixed marriages, spousal abuse, and things happening on Meets R5. And then if you listen to the lyrics, you realize there's almost a disjointed narrative. This is Steely Dan's best album, bar none. This was the height. Everything after was lesser. Still excellent, okay? Still great classic rock albums, but they reached their pinnacle with The Royal Scam. All right, so this next album almost made the top 10 list. Matter of fact, it was in the top 10 list, as high as number 8 at one point, but then I started thinking of other albums and everything, and it barely missed the top 10. It is by one of my favorite bands, probably in the top 5 or 6 favorite bands of all time, Deep Purple, and Ritchie Blackmore is my 4th favorite guitarist of all time. And I know it's just too cheeky of me to say that I am a fan of Deep Purple Mark II, to which I reply, who the hell isn't, okay? Even if it's not your favorite lineup, everybody loves this lineup. And the best album they ever put out, and they put out some great ones, is Machine Head. And that despite the fact that that album has Smoke on the Water on it. Now, I don't dislike Smoke on the Water. Matter of fact, I loved it the first time I heard it. And I loved it the first 100 times I heard it. I think it was about listen 1000 that it started losing its grip on me, okay? It's one of the most overplayed songs. So whenever I hear it on the radio, I turn it off, folks, because I do want to hear it while listening to this album. The album's got gloss, but it also feels like you're right there in the studio with them. The album is a trade-off of some of the best riffing you've ever heard between a guitarist and a keyboardist, John Lord and Ritchie Blackmore, dueling it out, sometimes intertwining. It's a great album. So next up, and appropriately so, Black Sabbath enters into the top 20. Now it's interesting, my emotionally most connected album to Black Sabbath was the first Black Sabbath album I had ever bought by them. And of course, I'm talking about Paranoid. But you know, my go-to album that I feel like Sabbath, which album has the most songs I like most of the time, would be Master of Reality. But even that album didn't make this list. And you know why? Because they actually topped that album, and it was the last truly great Sabbath album, in my opinion. And of course, I'm talking about Sabbath, Bloody Sabbath. Now, this has a more album feel. The cuts lean on each other better, and it's an easy listen from track one to track end, as I always say, right? And so if you're in the mood for an album, only a couple of these cuts might be on your favorite playlist, with several from Paranoid, several from Reality, and several from Four, right? But as an album, as it plays, and again, that gloss that I'm expecting, I think this album is wonderful. It didn't make the top 10 because it really, by this time in their career, it didn't set them apart from their peers at that time. It was more and more perfected Black Sabbath, but really no major barriers being broken, and that's fine too. Sabbath was that kind of band. Okay, so I mentioned John Lennon, and I also mentioned George Harrison. Paul McCartney also did not make the top 10, or at least not with this album, but he was in consideration, and the fact that I'm mentioning this later doesn't mean it outranks either Lennon or Harrison's albums. As a matter of fact, with this McCartney album and what I mentioned about George and John, I would probably put All Things Must Pass slightly above this album. And of course, I'm talking about Venus and Mars. Now, for all of you who are going, hey, wait a minute, man, Band on the Run's his best album, you should put that on the list. Listen, if I was going to be ranking the Wings album, Band on the Run, I always rank higher than Venus and Mars, not because it's a greater album, but because it was that style, that thing that he had created, that he continued for the next albums until Wings was done. There was no more developing the band sound at this point. And I've got to tell you, when I listen to these two albums, it's like Magical Mystery Tour. Venus and Mars is usually my go-to Paul McCartney and Wings album. And the material is every bit as strong as what you've got on Band on the Run, with fewer dips in quality and a lot more stretching in his writing, Love and Song, all right? And some bold kind of using a TV theme as part of the whole soundtrack and everything. And then when you went to go see him live, I know you guys are tired of me talking about seeing him back then, but he would play the big hits off the first early, he'd do My Love, right? But you didn't hear Big Barn Bed, no, but you heard lots of cuts from Band on the Run, lots of cuts from Venus and Mars, and cuts from Speed of Sound as well. This was part of what many people identify as Wings, and I think this album, as far as production and gloss and song quality from track to track, and standing alone away from his peers, like I said, it nearly missed the top 10. All right, so that leaves us to the final album on this half of the list. And I might be surprising you guys with this. A lot of people who would pick this artist would not pick this album, but it is by far my favorite album by Santana. And of course, I'm talking about Caravanserai. Here we see Carlos starting to embrace some jazz that he would explore for years to come, and yet this album is a delight on headphones, listening to what the percussion plays off on the guitar and the keyboards and the vocals and long stretches in between. As a matter of fact, this whole album reminds me of the one track by Black Sabbath, Planet Caravan. You know, I always wanted more of Planet Caravan, and here's an entire album. And the artwork just, you know what, I think of this album cover when I listen to Planet Caravan by Black Sabbath. All right, that leads us to the top 10, and from now on, everything is being ranked in order. In the number 10 position is an album by an artist I really didn't discover until 1978. Now you gotta understand, I was 23 in those days, kind of starting to get set in your ways, right? And the teenage son of some friends of mine really loved the fact that I liked rock and roll. He loved rock and roll, and he asked me, "Have you heard the album Pyramid by the Alan Parsons Project?" Now, I was already a major Beatles fan, and I was aware of Alan Parsons doing Dark Side of the Moon, his work with the Beatles, but I didn't know that he had actually had a couple of albums out. I really wasn't looking for albums by former engineers who are now producers. But he says, "Oh no, this is great. You know, it's kind of a concept album and everything." And he lent me his copy. I took it home and I fell in love with the Alan Parsons Project. And you know what? For years, Pyramid was my favorite album. But you know what? I immediately started picking up his albums, and as they started coming out, and the one album that really kind of hit me hard, I'm a science fiction novel reader, okay? Or at least a lot of the great science fiction novelists of the 30s, 40s, and 50s, and into the 60s. I started losing interest as they became more fantasy based. But you know, I've got to tell you, anything that was inspired by Isaac Asimov, my favorite science fiction writer of all time, has got my attention. And of course, I was already familiar with his they weren't really calling them the robot novels back in those days, but true fans knew there was a connected universe. We would talk to each other about that. Now, what sets this album apart, it's not the fact that it's not gloss, but as the Alan Parsons Project progressed, they got even glossier. I'm a major fan of Eye in the Sky, and I absolutely adore Turn of a Friendly Card. Wasn't a great fan of Eve, but there was no Alan Parsons album I ever heard that didn't offer me something. But I, Robot goes the extra distance. First of all, the collection of songs here is superb. Also, they go the extra distance by not following the storyline from the novels, but taking on the personalities of the robot and what they see us as. And before you're done with this album, you find yourself looking into the soul of the robot. Either way, this album will not only make you think, take you on quite a trip, but the song strength is good enough for even the casual listener. All right, that leads us to the number 9 position. Neil Young enters the fray, and he does so with his wonderful Harvest album. You know, I watch streams here on YouTube, especially with the vinyl community and everything, and I was listening to some people talk about this. I don't even recall which stream it was, but several individuals had mentioned that they didn't care for this album when it got, especially one cut on the second side, when it got too orchestrational, right? And you know what? I thought about that at the time, and I went, "You're nuts," all right? But the more I think about it, it would be kind of cool to hear all of the orchestration taken off of the album and do a, kind of a stripped down version, kind of like what we got with Paul McCartney's new release Band on the Run, right? With the second disc on that. But as an album and as it's recording, it's the orchestrations that give this album a gloss. This is barely out of the country genre, all right? This is country rock, but not quite. Well, it's Neil freaking Young, and not a weak cut on this album. You know what? Back in the day, FM radio stations played pretty much every damn cut equally, or at least they did in the Bay Area out here in California. Okay, number 8, the first artist to enter into either list for a second time, Paul McCartney's Ram album. Say it loud, say it proud, because I'm gonna tell you, I loved this album back when it was not popular to love this album. And you know what? Finally, the album's gotten its due. Critics started softening their views on it. But the fact is the critics liked it all along. They were getting orders from higher on. I've covered that in the past. No need to get into that. But this album got bad reviews because it had enemies. But true art always wins in the end. Most Beatle fans, it seems like to me, these days will name this as their favorite Paul McCartney album, and for good reason. Talk about song strength. Well, you're talking about one of the Beatles, so song strength is never a problem with them. Production, here's a story for you. I forget the name of the guy. I mentioned him in another video. Some of this info I have to do research on, but he was mixing this album in LA. And he said he took that on because the song spoke to him and everything. And he did some bold mixing choices, and he was worried that McCartney might not like it. McCartney stood stunned when he heard the mix that this guy did. Did this album stand apart from his peers? You damn right this album stood apart from his peers. Everybody derided him. All 3 ex-Beatles thought it was trash. But that's interesting, and the album sold well. Paul doesn't usually put out material that doesn't sell decently. But I've got to tell you, this album had a #1 hit, Uncle Albert and Avril Halsey. So don't tell me people didn't like some of the music on this album. That cut is one of the weakest cuts on this album, and it is magnificent. It's just I've heard it too many times on the radio. So what album would be number 7, beating Ram by Paul McCartney? Well, this isn't just a list of pop rock albums, folks. This is a list that, as you can tell, has covered several genres, and we're going to go to prog rock here, but not because, I want to put a prog rock this high on the list, but because this prog rock band created the album, one of my favorite. I always listen to it in its complete entirety. Of course, I'm talking about Yes's Close to the Edge. Now, I even remember the day I bought this album. I brought it home. I had one of those small record players. I was living at home, and I placed that on. It was a sunny day with a mild breeze, folks. I don't know why. And everything looked kind of orange. I would get those kind of auras about days from time. And I put this on, and I placed that, and no crackles, brand new record. And the birds with the weather, this album had me. And then when I realized after about 4 listens that this was a pastiche of many song ideas all over, whether they were split up into 2 songs on side 2 or the one grand song on side 1. Yes, made many albums on this level in their career, but this is the one that rises just to the top for me, folks. All right, so the next album is interesting because many people claim that this album is badly mixed. A lot of audiophiles don't like this album. And I think they're full of shit, to tell you the truth. Now, I've done a bit of mixing and recording in my lifetime, and nothing on this level, trust me, folks. But I hear an album that, especially if you take into consideration the studio that they had, there's not enough time to go into that story, but they were fighting time with Led Zeppelin back and forth. I think what happened with this album, by the way, I'm talking about Aqualung, all right? Aqualung is at this level right here. I think that a lot of fans just heard Ian Anderson cut this album down in interviews over the years. He doesn't like the mix, okay? But there's often times when artists don't like the mix, and generally the fans love it, even the critics love it. I can think of several examples when John Lennon thought several of his songs he'd like to have them totally remixed. He thought Paul got too busy on them and all of that. In the end, he was wrong, okay? But there was a lot of squabbling. I think if John had survived, in the end, he would be firmly saying, hey, this is what we did, there's our stamp, and I'm damn proud of it. Well, this is one of those albums, okay? All right, and the subject matter, again, talking about, headlines, is about a homeless man who is mentally ill, who has the hots for a mentally ill, young preteen perhaps even. Okay, and on side one, we see his lecherous decay. Side two serves as an explanation to the character of Aqualung, and it gives him humanity. We find out that he was a young boy who was raised in a pretty decent family. He was sent off to a boarding school of sorts and received a higher education, all right? But things happened. Someone messed with his woman, and that damn train, it just won't slow down. There's a whole story. This is an album you don't just play your favorite cuts from, folks. You don't even put them on playlists. You wait and savor for the time that you can be taken on a magic carpet ride. Aqualung by Jethro Tull. All right, we're in the top 5. We're going to completely change our style of band here. And of course, I'm talking about the wonderful Police. And the album that I choose as the 5th most perfect album in rock is, of course, Synchronicity. Now, the very title and the 2 songs connected to that title, and then the territories they travel on, all the other material on this album is exactly what makes it great. Now, the Police never put out a bad album. 5 albums out, 5 absolutely wonderful albums, but they did kind of go in a linear fashion. The first 2 albums is a little debatable if the second one was better or not, but it seemed that every album they got better, never missing the mark. This was their 5th and final album, and it even dueled very well against Michael Jackson's Thriller album. The song Synchronicity 2 would be in my top 10 greatest songs in rock history. But then again, I've always been a sucker for songs about mental breakdowns and monsters on the shore. Okay, so at number 4, Joe Walsh and the album Barnstorm. Now, Joe Walsh has had several incarnations in his career. He's been a pseudo member of the Eagles for a long time now. Before that, he started his career pretty much with the James Gang. He had a solo career, but there was this short stint where he was part of the band Barnstorm. And their first album, Barnstorm, is not only my favorite Joe Walsh album, it is my 4th pick for the most perfect album in rock and roll. Listen to the lush bass lines. Listen to the interspersing of the orchestration that is supplied that takes this album up another notch. And somehow that nasally voice of Joe Walsh sounds even better with this type of orchestration. I saw them live. They were touring this album. I bought it right after the concert and fell in love with it. Barnstorm, number 4. All right, in the final 3, it's interesting. I always talk about my Mount Rock Olympus list, right? And my top 3 bands are the Beatles, Led Zeppelin, and Pink Floyd. I've often said the Beatles are Zeus, right? And Led Zeppelin is Poseidon, second in charge, with Pink Floyd, for various reasons, representing Hades. Well, the top 3 albums would have to come from these very bands. So, at number 3, I choose Led Zeppelin's Houses of the Holy. You know what? This album is starting to gain popularity with Led Zeppelin fans in the last 10 years. It's getting higher on people's list. I'm glad for that. It was always number 1 for me for decades, and then I kind of bumped 4 up there for what it had accomplished, right? And depending on my mood, this album is either my favorite or second favorite Led Zeppelin album, but I gotta tell you, this is my go-to Led Zeppelin album. When I just want to hear Led Zeppelin as an album, this is the first thing I usually grab, right? The production, they would never reach a whole album's worth of production like this, although they touched this production on Physical Graffiti, of course. But this whole album has a gloss to it, and there's this almost gentle liftoff on this album that I love. And just when you think you've heard enough acoustic bass Led Zeppelin, they kick it into high gear, and then they throw a song at you that nobody would ever think any band would record. You know, that's a recording you either love or you hate. I love it, and it's the perfect jar into the next movement for the album. Of course, the album cover is as good as the music inside. This, to me, is Led Zeppelin packaged perfectly. All right, it's at number 2, where Hades kind of cuts in line of Poseidon. And of course, I'm talking about Pink Floyd's magnificent Dark Side of the Moon. You know, this album, despite all of the crap that comes out of Roger Waters' mouth these days, is, I think, as close as the band ever got to equal writing and or equal input. We have stuff by Mason here. We have stuff by the beloved, rest in peace, Richard Wright. And of course, one of the greatest guitarists in rock, supplying a lot of the orchestrations with his guitar playing. I think that's his whole style, is to orchestrate a song, right? And of course, he's well represented on this album, but you gotta give the heavier nod to Roger Waters. This is Roger Waters when Roger Waters had common sense. Now, he wasn't a less angry. Matter of fact, he was probably an angrier young man at this point. But you see, when he would write about the things that concerned him, he allowed those ideas to breathe. And he wrote in a way that people could come up with their own ideas about what he was trying to come across. This is why I love this album. This is subtlety and majesty all on the same album. All right, that leads us to the number 1 spot, and the Beatles' Almighty Zeus are on this list as well. Now, most of you know that I absolutely love Rubber Soul. Rubber Soul is my favorite Beatle album. Number 2 would be Revolver, okay? And Abbey Road doesn't get on that list until about number 4, all right? But I have often said this is their grandest album. This is the album you almost have to listen to as an entire album. Or at least if you put on side 2, there's no stopping it until the end, right? Now, there are so many reasons why I like this album. First of all, George Harrison writes 2 of the best songs the Beatles ever wrote, let alone George. Second of all, although John is not fully into writing and making sure that he's writing 50% of the album here, and there are a couple of weak cuts from him, we'll discuss that, but John's 2 tracks on side 1 hold side 1, all right? And I just heard somebody say that they didn't care for I Want You, She's So Heavy. I think it's a wonderful, oh boy, that is, It's a masterpiece, folks. But side 2 gives us an idea of what Paul McCartney can do with George Martin kind of holding his hand a bit there and convincing John to give a couple of his lesser moments in. And by the way, Paul offers a couple of his lesser moments. But interweave Lennon and McCartney in this fashion, and the whole side takes off. And John does have one magnificent song on this side for sure, and that's Because. All right, folks, that's the video for tonight. I hope you enjoyed it. Please give me a thumbs up, man. Every time you get so many thumbs up, then the video goes to a wider audience and catches fire and all of that stuff. And if you haven't subbed to this channel yet, I don't know why you're waiting, especially if you drop in occasionally. Hit that subscribe to the tribe button, and then you'll be notified of all my videos, just like this one. Everyone who subscribed got a notification for this video. And I do want you guys answering my poll, all right? Because a whole video depends on your voting, folks. Until then, I'm Michael Noland. This is The Bottom Line. And together, folks, don't forget, we are the tribe.